Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who see everything others miss, and why this ability destroys them. In his clinical practice, Jung documented patients with what he called differentiated perception, individuals who could read micro-expressions, sense hidden emotions, and perceive psychological patterns that escaped everyone else. They saw through social masks, detected lies instantly, and felt the unconscious tensions in every room. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these people consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. Today, I'll show you Jung's most dangerous discovery about people who see everything, and why he believed this rare ability either destroys you or transforms you into something extraordinary. The case that revealed Jung's most dangerous discovery began with a patient he described in his private notes, a highly introverted intuitive type who came to him in 1913 during Jung's own psychological crisis following his break with Freud. This patient, representing what Jung would later categorize as the rarest personality type, possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere, who was lying, who was in emotional pain, who harbored secret resentments. Jung wrote, "The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage." She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. He documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. Because this patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain, therefore Jung began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes, "There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment." Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her research shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology, the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who don't just feel deeply, but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into." This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. But Jung discovered the real danger wasn't the perception itself, Because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly, therefore they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." But he discovered this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experienced this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd express concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence, it was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected." This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed, "The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself." This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force they can't rationally explain. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was still to come. Because Jung observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals. Therefore, he identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. These individuals don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely, they often can't distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment." Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted, "They possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see." Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote, "These individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical dis-ease in their environment." Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed, "They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively." Understanding your specific pattern is crucial, because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, You need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Because Jung observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on his patients, therefore he concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force." Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of superior function, when your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. He wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them." Danger 3. Identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. He wrote, "The danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession." This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, therefore Jung developed what he called